Thank you for choosing Talks News, your only source into autonomous research and development. I am your host, a wacko weirdo, rebel scum, Jedi hero, and today's date be May 11th, 2021. And as usual, we are pledging allegiance to liberty and justice for all. I accidentally restarted the music rather than doing my classic fade out. Little jumbled together. Let's get the ball rolling now. Per usual, the weekly Militia Watch update is here live and direct. So before getting into the couple of video segments of conservative cringism, we're going to get into this update here. Oh boy, oh boy, oh boy. Here is another weekly update from Militia Watch. And you can find it, the link in the description below, where they usually have further readings inside this update within itself. And you can always go to militia.watch and get your updates and get your articles on militias. And you can also follow them on Twitter at Militia Watch. So this week, Minnesota Boogaloo Boy joins comrade pleads guilty to terror charges. Wisconsin man charged with terrorism for Wolverine plot involvement. Georgia Stone Mountain participant charged for role in J6. And the sixth state this year passes 2A sanctuary legislation. So, Michael Solomon of Minnesota is the second of two Boogaloo adherents to plead guilty to federal terrorism charges related to their activities in the wake of George Floyd's murder. He and Benjamin Teeter of North Carolina participated in armed patrols around Minneapolis before talking to undercover informants who claimed to be members of Hamas. Hamas in the news today, or I guess this week, mainly because of the rising tensions going on in Israel, Palestine. I will probably get to the Ben Shapiro segment here. Not this episode. There's definitely a little bit more context and backstory to get into before I tackle literally the entire video of misinformation. But all of that is irrelevant specifically here to this article. I just find it very funny that this guy was posing as a member of Hamas, you know, the Palestine Authority. So that's interesting. Teeter pled guilty late last year. Apologies. Yep, so Michael Solomon of Minnesota and Benjamin Teeter of North Carolina participated in armed patrols around Minneapolis before talking to undercover informants who claimed to be members of Hamas. That is very weird. I wonder if maybe the Boogaloo adherents do have a bit more of, I would say, sympathies towards the Hamas leadership out in Palestine, maybe. I do think that's very interesting that that's the group that the sting or the undercover cops use to sting them. So it's pretty interesting stuff right there. Moving on. Brian Higgins, a Wisconsin man charged in association with the alleged Michigan kidnapping plot, was arraigned last week. He was charged with one count of providing material support to an act of terrorism, and his bail was set at $100,000. Glenn Mitchell Simon of Georgia is one of the newest charged related to the J6 storming of the U.S. Capitol building. Simon was also an attendee to the August 2020 Neo-Confederate Militia Rally in Stone Mountain, which was covered by Militia Watch, and you can find further reading in this article. He has also said that he has traveled to several other states since summer 2020 to counter-demonstrate against BLM protests. Cool beans. Christopher Worrell, a Proud Boys member charged in J6, was denied a request to be released from custody. Evidence in his trial includes footage of him spraying pepper spray at police as part of the J6 storming. He also attended November Million MAGA March events in D.C., during which he professed his expertise about ice cream sandwiches. Part of Worrell's request to be released was because he said his D.C. jurors, quote, voted almost hold on. Let me restart this one. Part of Worrell's request to be released was because he said his D.C. jurors, quote, voted almost unanimously against Donald Trump, unquote. Very interesting. He did not think that he was being judged by his peers. I don't know, like, that kind of concerns me because, like, I feel like you could make that argument in any court case. I guess it's very specific here to the J6, but I feel like you could, yeah, they don't agree with me politically. This jury is not of my peers, you know? Alrighty. Oklahoma became the 6th state this year to ratify a bill making the state a Second Amendment sanctuary, allowing it to claim it supersedes the federal government regarding gun restrictions. Arizona, Arkansas, Montana, and West Virginia all passed similar legislation in April of this year. Prior to 2021, other states also passed similar laws at the state level. Alaska in July 2010, Idaho, March 2014, Kansas, April 2013, and Wyoming, March 2010. More counties throughout the country have also passed similar bills at a county or local level, and it's unclear if any of these will technically hold up in court. Republicans in Texas indicate that a 7th state is considering a similar approach. Ha ha ha. Yep, very interesting. I don't really see the federal government coming for everybody's guns, but you know, these politicians are going to pass that legislation, be damned, you know? They're going out of their way to do it. The Biden administration has been weighing several new policy initiatives regarding the far right in the U.S. One potential put forward is particularly Kafkaesque, which is contracting private intelligence firms to surveil these groups. This would appear to be intended to smooth over a technicality that blocks the DHS from legally monitoring U.S. residents. It's very funny that the government does worry about legal, overreach from time to time. They always need the pretext of like, well, this is, legal since we wrote the law, Anyways, some of this is likely related to pushes that are exemplified by this week's Senate questions against the FBI for failing to stop the J6 breach. This is part of a larger package that does mark a shift from Trump, but it is yet unclear how legal or effective it truly may be. Given new knowledge about the White House ordering the phone records of Washington Post reporters surfaced this past week, setting precedent like this could mean further surveillance of other political adversaries during or after Biden's term. And that's usually, the pretext that everybody worries about. They put in legislation against right-wing groups, and left-wing has concerns that it will be eventually used against them, and vice versa. So it's, it's always this pendulum swinging. The far right do something that begs the Leviathan to crack down and tighten security, and then left-wing movements suffer because of it. And, the same as well. Like when the pretext to take everyone's guns away in the 60s was mostly for the Black Panthers because they scared a bunch of white people. Alrighty. So we got Oath Keepers. Further reading on Oath Keepers' sketchy finance setup coming from BuzzFeed. And there's also Carlos Zapata's 9+ months of threats and violence at critics, which comes from a news cafe. And you can find those in the description below inside this Militia Watch update. Now, wonderful. The militia has been updated, or at least you have been updated of the militias.
Yeah.
And my setup is just working.
This is something that I know I was taught, and this is something right now.
Flawlessly. I have a laptop from the year 2011, and this is what I'm using to record the podcast. So when you hear technical difficulties, that is exactly what is happening. A laptop that is about 10 years old, basically just trying to keep its shit together. Anyways, as you could probably tell from the accidental playing of that segment, we're getting into Louder with Crowder. He did like a 2-parter, which I think he released on separate days, but allegedly debunking the slave patrol police myth. Oh boy. Let's do it. Let's hear him allegedly debunk this myth.
So this is something they teach. They're going to be teaching in schools. And this is something that I know I was taught. And this is something right now that if you run bring up this overlay first. If you run a search, just to give you an idea, if you run a search right now, police force slave patrol, right, are the American police rooted in racism, slave patrols? You will not find on YouTube. You will not find on Google. You might find one. I saw one op-ed from the Baltimore Sun. Yeah. Everything else claims that it's true. Way down the list, Snopes said mixed. When Snopes says mixed, you know, and it's a leftist claim, you know that means they're saying, this is pretty much a stretch. Yeah. There is no basis in reality. I want to be really clear, and you need to be able to educate your children who will be indoctrinated with this. Because, look, if you say the police force is racist, it was rooted in racism, then you delegitimize the entire police force. Kind of like you guys want to say that Donald Trump wanted to delegitimize the presidency by saying there might be some actual some fraud at play here. You guys want to say there were slave patrols, then there was a police force. Ergo, police all racist. And do you know who that harms most? That harms Black Americans, most people who live in urban communities who need the police more than farmers out in the middle of nowhere in Idaho. So,
yeah, I guess so. Anyways, like the thing that I find interesting about this discussion is that it does take a bit of critical race theory to actually analyze the origins of policing and figure what pieces of it may have its roots in racism and quite possibly slave patrol. So just to say like outright, like this is a ridiculous claim just because, you know, there's mixed feelings coming from Snopes, which apparently has validity on Crowder's show now, just because it kind of fits the narrative. But, you know, anytime Snopes actually fact checks something of the right wing persuasion, that's when it becomes like, oh, well, it's a left leaning, it's got a bias, we shouldn't take it seriously. But yet in this particular segment, like even the leftist Snopes says mixed feelings about it. So we might want to take that into consideration. Is just weird. Very weird, Crowder, because like before, usually, normally, all the time, most of the time, you don't really even like consider it. You don't like fact checkers, you know? You're not a big fan of them. You yourself is the fact checker. Isn't that right, Steven? So let's get back to you debunking, since you seem to have all the facts.
This is a claim, I don't want you to take my word for it, that you've heard for many, many years, and now they want to teach it in schools, that it was born out of slavery. Here's a montage for you.
Law enforcement, all built upon them. Policing itself started out as slave patrols. We know that.
Wrong.
And so what we've got to do is stop trying to put a Band-Aid on this problem and attack the institution that is perpetuating this culture.
This is not a training issue. This is much more.
That guy on Fox really looks like Superman with alcoholic hepatitis, doesn't he?
Most people don't know that the forefathers of what is our modern day policing were slave patrols.
For much of US history, law enforcement meant enforcing laws that were explicitly designed to subjugate black people. Some of America's first law enforcement units were the slave patrols tasked with capturing and returning people who'd escaped from slavery.
Well, you know, it's kind of ironic because the original constables that we had before an official police force were based on Old England law, where they had a system of police over there.
That's interesting.
Yeah, but he wants to. You know what? Look, I know people. We welcome you. Bring us your poor, you're tired, you're hungry, you're mediocre.
It's very funny to be like, well, we modeled them after the English constables. Dude, like, just because we, like, it's an offshoot of something that already exists doesn't mean that we have a different origin story of, like, what specifically police have existed throughout the entirety existence of society. As long as there are laws, there were a need or a requirement of those to enforce those laws. So it's very weird that you would say, well, we're just modeling the English constables, and why aren't we talking about their racism? Well, because we're living in America and we're dealing with American laws and our institutions. So that's just weird to, you know, pivot that way rather than, you know, directly talking about the arguments being presented to you.
Host, we understand it. But there is Mexican something that rubs us, Mexican racist, that rubs us the wrong way about a person who sounds like everyone we left telling us how we should do it here.
When we only copied.
And yet that's also very amazing to me because Crowder's like from Canada. we left. Like, I'm getting my fucking exclusionary on now that like Crowder's considering us we left, and that we gave up all of those things. And homeboys from Canada, like John Oliver has just as much right to criticize American policing, since he is a resident citizen of America as much as Crowder. So weird that like an immigrant saying like an immigrant has no place. That's so weird.
Them.
Right.
In the first place.
For a small part. And then we
get rid of
improved
it.
upon
Well, for the police, yeah.
So again, like I said, there's a bunch of censorship at play here, and these are the general claims. It's important because you'll even see, this is what bothers me. You have leftist pseudo-intellectuals who make these arguments, and then you have people on the right. You have conservative pseudo-intellectuals, and I mean pseudo-intellectuals who say, well, this isn't really widespread. This is a fringe idea. No, it's not. It's not only no longer a fringe idea. They have a forced captive audience with your children. And then in university, 16 years, Joe Biden.
I think it's very also fascinating that Crowder's like worried about this kind of thing, that, police departments adopted slave patrol tactics, like that is like so radical that we need to be worried about it going into the mainstream, when it was like nowhere near my public school education. My public school education was like, yes, we had slaves, but we ultimately freed them, making us the good guys. There's not much of an in-depth look, like, because we didn't have critical race theory when I was in public school in my K through 12 days. That's something that would predominantly come into your history lessons as you started to hit college, and that seems to be kind of changing as like we're starting to recognize that people on every level, whether it's common knowledge or the academic, need to be aware of our race relation history within this nation. It's just very weird now that like something that is like broader, more in-depth history is a radical fringe thing that needs to be beaten back before it becomes common knowledge. Yikes, dude. Like that's so yikes, because it's critical thinking. Like it's actually observing history as it was and not just glossing over it with the pretty parts,
Wants now. Teach this to kids and then make sure that taxpayer dollars fund that kind of education for 16 years. Let's go through this claim by claim. The most popular claims, if you see that I've missed one or you have some questions, we'll take them in chat later on Mug Club, or just submit them, comment below which ones you think we've missed, because it's hard to kind of put this together.
And just quickly, we did math wrong yesterday. It's 17 years. Kindergarten, 1 through 12, plus 2, plus 2.
So you also saw the tweet?
Yeah, I did see the...
Why are all of them wearing body armor inside of the studio? I know this is podcast format, so you can't see any of this, but they are all, I think maybe except for a couple of them, like the audio engineers, are wearing body armor inside a studio around just each other. What is this? Like, what kind of flex is this? Is it the idea that they're, they got targets on them, so they have to wear body armor even if they're in the safest place they possibly could be? Or is it just like the idea, like, we support the police, we wear vests too because we go out in these streets worried that a black person's just going to shoot us when we pull them over? Like, what is the point of the bulletproof vest right now? And the fact that everybody's wearing it. It's weird.
Tweet, they're like,
gentleman...
you guys suck at math. Okay,
so let's go to some of these claims here, that police were formed specifically to catch runaway slaves.
The structure of this country, whether we want to admit it or not, is based on racism.
Did
this
someone
country
hook
started
a
on
battery up to the
genocide
sink
and
before he came onto this show?
transatlantic slave trade. And the country was built
Saw
on the
you in
backs
Home
of
Alone.
black folks who made this country.
That's awesome. Like that like hooking. Oh my God. Electric. Like I am like 90% sure that was some racist shit. Just like, just making a comment about his hair. I know, like making a comment about someone's hair isn't necessarily, an attack on their racial identity, but in some cases it is. And if you got to make a comment, the fact that some dude has an afro, oh man, I'm not going to, it was just so subtle. That was so under the radar, Crowder. Holy shit. Wow.
As great as it is, whatever that means. And until we recognize that, and specifically in policing, it was built on slave catching. That's the institution of policing was built on slave catching.
Now, the only legitimate excuse for Kamal Bell, comedian, by the way, you always know they're a comedian when they have to remind you, looking that way on that show is if immediately before, and he said, yeah, I'm ready for my hit, I just got to wash my hands.
We gotta talk to Samson.
So, okay, that's the basis of it.
my
Look,
God.
this is one thing, too. We're going to do a segment tomorrow on...
Like, yet again, just like, I don't know how many times they do this. They play a clip of somebody who makes an argument, makes a case, does a premises and a conclusion, and yet he makes a joke about the hair again. In the weirdest way, too, and completely unfunny. I don't know who the fuck finds this shit funny. Or just specifically that joke. That was horrible. Just so dumb. But, like, the fact that you never address the argument after you come out of a clip and immediately just go with this dumb joke to attack the way that he looks. There's millions of people viewing this shit and consuming it as if it was Popeye's spinach when actually it's just Popeye's, like, cum and shit. Like, what the fuck, dude? Wow.
On DC statehood. Does it pass a sniff test? And what do I mean, sniff test? You go, hold on a second. Okay, you start off with a macro view. They're claiming that this is why the police exist. With DC statehood, I hadn't done a ton of research on it recently because I remember the first time I looked it up, people were saying, why is DC the only place that it's not a state? And I went, that's a good question. Why is it? And I looked it up and I said, to be impartial. That makes sense. There's a lot of other, that completely makes sense as to why it would be different.
Right.
It's congruent with the other reasons that it's unique. Same thing.
What is that excuse? That DC has to remain not a state to be impartial, even though it has like citizens like every other metropolitan area that also, Virginia, Maryland, they've all got citizens. They're all not Virginia, but Maryland's incredibly tiny, right? And New Hampshire, incredibly small state. And yet for some reason they have people who live within them who have representation. Why specifically is DC supposed to remain impartial? It's because it has Congress and it has the president, right? That's why. I'm assuming that's why. So then isn't it an even bigger problem that we still stick with the duopoly system where apparently we have to have a left versus a right kind of politics that would require the impartiality for one particular state to remain in? And if it was to have that impartiality, why would we have people living in there and paying taxes? It's just strange. That's a strange argument to make. To keep statehood away from DC rather than just like actually moving progressively forward through our political system.
Here you go, hold on a second. They say that it was created for, but wait, sniff test. Do other countries have police? Have there been police forces? Yes, every society, ancient Rome.
Oh my God, every society has had a police force. There's no way they could all be racist, is his argument. Jesus Christ. He brings up Roman Greeks too, as if they didn't have slaves and they also didn't use their police forces to go round up runaway slaves. Like, what are you... Bruh. The sniff test, but like, you're just... Oh my God, you're sniffing through your ear. Like, what the fuck are you saying, Crowder? Like...
Rome, Augustus Caesar created a police force. In England, in the 13th century, they formed a body of constables and justices to keep the peace, which we mimicked here in the United States. Pretty similar. I think it was 1630s is when we did it. And
there's been police everywhere. There's been police everywhere. How can ours be rooted in slavery? Like, that's like his baseline value of the sniff test. Like, we couldn't have slave patrols because everybody had police. Haha. Proof. Rather than actually like dissecting, history and getting context, proper, good, whole, American, wholesome context. Let's see. Let's go down here. All right. And I'm just going to say real quick, I'll recommend a couple things. There is a podcast by Robert Evans from iHeartRadio. He does Behind the Bastards, which is one of my favorite podcasts of all time, where he usually goes into the history of history's, or like he reads stories of history's most bastardy bastards. Great podcast. He brings a comedian on. Good time. He's done other projects such as It Could Happen Here, the Women's War, talking about the Civil War in Rojava. Syria, Rojava, and then I'm missing one. It could have in here. The War on Everyone, where he focuses on American far right fascism and all of that. But he has Behind the Police, which he brings on a rapper / another podcaster named Propaganda, and they kind of break down a bit of the history between the slave patrols and the first police departments, both in the Union North and the Confederate South. So if you're interested in an easy listen while you're getting shit done, and it's kind of funny from time to time, Behind the Police is one of my highest recommendations. Let's see. The End of Policing. Let me see if I can find the author again. The End of Policing is a really good book. I would highly recommend that, by Alex S. Vitale. Check that one out. It was free like last month, the digital version, or last year it was free, but now I think it's about $10 for the digital version. Yeah, $10 ebook. You can get it for free with an Audible premium subscription on Audible. So if you want to listen to it on the go, there's that option as well, but you can also find it at bookstores. The End of Policing is a really good one. And then there's another recommendation here within this article that I'm going to be using here. No, I'm on the wrong page. Let's see here. Scroll. We have Slave Patrols, Law and Violence in Virginia and the Carolinas by Sally Hayden, who is a historian. There is 3 options for you that are much better than the rest of the, 8 minutes of this Crowder video. So again, Behind the Police with Robert Evans and Propaganda. That's his artist name, not that it is Propaganda. That's his artist name. So anyways, Behind the Police, End of Policing, and Slave Patrols, Law and Violence in Virginia and the Carolinas. There is 3 sources that will be substantially and nutritionally better and more empowering if you are that interested in history than what we're about to go through right now. I can only assume. So let's begin.
Also, by the way, today, every non-white society still has police forces in one form or another. Granted, It might be Coney. But you take what you can get. The point is, are all these African countries racist? Are all these Middle Eastern countries racist? It doesn't pass that initial sniff test.
No one.
It's just so amazing. Like, because everybody has police, police can't be racist. It's a thing that happens around the world. Where there is law, there is law enforcement. And if that is so, then it can't be racist. As if, China didn't use its law enforcement to actually gather up. It probably used military, which is basically a federalized version of law enforcement. They used them to gather up all the Uyghur Muslims and take them to their re-education camps, where we are still to this day designating it as an active genocide. So, is that not racist? I don't know, man. I don't know. There's military servicemen around the globe. I don't know. Anyways, from this specific article here, just to give a little bit of historical context, since, we're not getting any so far, we're getting the argument that there are cops everywhere, thus cops can't be racist. First formed in 1704 in South Carolina, patrols lasted over 150 years, only technically ending with the abolition of slavery during the Civil War. However, just because the patrols lost their lawful status did not mean that their influence died out in 1865. Sally Haddon argues, and she wrote the book that I mentioned earlier, argues there are distinct parallels between the legal slave patrols before the war and extra-legal terrorization tactics used by vigilante groups during Reconstruction, most notoriously the Ku Klux Klan. After the Civil War, Southern police departments often carried over aspects of the slave patrols. These included systematic surveillance, the enforcement of curfews, and even notions of who could become a police officer. Though a small number of African Americans joined the police force in the South during Reconstruction, they met active resistance. Though law enforcement looks very different today, the profession developed from practices implemented in the colonies. It's almost as if shit doesn't happen in a vacuum. It's almost as if everything is an evolvement of past events. But not on Crowder's show. Crowder lives in a blank void where things come and go, and he has to address them as is.
one, from Brett Baer to anybody else that we saw there, from CNN or MSNBC, said one word like, well, there's
to be fair,
an
I don't know if some of them did down the line or corrected it after the segment.
I've watched a lot of these too, and I haven't seen that.
Yeah, I
yet.
haven't
So you're
seen
right.
it
If they did do it, then that's
we don't want another 16-17 scandal in our midst, folks.
Camabel, or whatever his name is.
It's 16 gate.
Didn't get changed. He didn't get challenged.
No,
at
he
all.
didn't. Well, and also, so we had the system of constables.
better than
and
18
justices.
gate.
And then the first modern police department, for people, it was created in Boston in 1838, immediately followed by New York City. I believe it was in Albany, Chicago, Philadelphia,
yep.
a lot of Northeast places where slavery was outlawed. So again, this is something they'll make the claim. Well, look at these slave patrols. Sure, they existed, but to try and say that the Minneapolis Police Department today is based on some kind of a slave patrol from the antebellum South doesn't pass the sniff test. So then we change into a modern police force, organized.
You would have to specifically look into that police department in the first place. Which one was he mentioning?
Department today.
Hold on.
Places where slavery was outlawed. So again, this is something they'll make the claim. Well, look at these slave patrols. Sure, they existed, but to try and say that the Minneapolis Police Department today is based on some kind of a slave patrol from the antebellum South doesn't pass the sniff test. So then we change into a modern police force, organized, sort of bureaucratic police departments. They were formed specifically in urban areas, American cities, for the purpose of reducing crime, often mob violence against blacks in a post-Civil War era. And look, if you want to make the argument that there was quite a bit of union busting that came up from the cops back then because they were trying to strike and they wanted to maintain the economic status quo, sure, you could make that argument. You can't make the argument that it's based in slave patrols. Something else, too.
I mean, it's very weird that you can make either or argument as if neither of them were very true. But as my understanding from the history of behind the police is that it is indefinitely true that at the same time as we were dismantling the slave patrols, or at least their their authority, as we were dismantling their authority and adopting it into police departments, at the same time police departments were used to break and bust unions. There's actually a pretty famous war in Colorado dealing with the, I believe it was coal mines. I think what is known as like the Coal Wars of Colorado or something like that lasted for about a year to 2 years, where they literally just wanted 8-hour work weeks and higher pay, and yet had to face up against the local police, the National Guard, and Pinkertons. And at one point, the Pinkertons ended up basically massacring a bunch of women and children just because they wanted higher pay and less working hours. They didn't want to be continually worked as if they were indentured servants. So, both things can be true, especially since that one predominantly happened in the later 1800s, closer to the beginning of the 1900s, as there were less slaves to catch at the time. So,
Dude, that's pretty important to note. Today, over 15% of police departments are black. They have 15% of police officers are black. Higher portion than the general population. It's about 12-point-something%.
Yeah.
That's over a 20% increase of their representation in the general population.
That's
so
pretty good.
Apparently they didn't get the
that's amazing. That like it's impressive that 12% of cops are black, and that's a 20% increase. Isn't like from what were the years on that? Because like that's not impressive data whatsoever. A 20% increase, leaving them at 12%. There's actually no dates. What is the increase from? From what years? From when? From the beginning of time? What are we talking about?
an increase of their representation in the general population.
That's
so
pretty good.
Apparently they didn't get the memo. Kamal Bell. And by the way, this is something too. Who does it harm? Police are far more necessary in large urban areas today where who's likely to be the victim of black crime? Black people.
Yeah.
Right? Police interactions in rural areas, they're significantly lower than in, say, inner city Detroit. Right? This is something, again, you want to take them away from these neighborhoods? Okay, and we'll get back.
I mean, that's the thing is that, you know, Crowder and other right-wing conservatives will argue is that, you know, police, you know, black people need police to protect them from other black people. And I'm not really going to get into the racist implications of that sentence. But the thing is, though, is that, yeah, high crime areas tend to need more police presence because you guessed it, there's crime. Although there hasn't been shown through any data collection or studies that the presence of police actually decreases the amount of crime. So as far as a deterrent, they're not very successful. As far as something that rounds up people to throw them and lock them away, well, the data shows that they're incredibly good at doing that. And you guessed it, that when you are found guilty of a crime or made a felon, you are much closer to a slave. In fact, it's included in the Constitution, in the amendment that freed the slaves, that says that people who are prisoners are exempt. They are allowed to serve as slaves. So very interesting there, how it's not quite rounding up the slaves so much as just kind of recruiting them. But it's not a black cultural problem, because white areas that are low income, high in crime, have the same kind of problems. So it's not a cultural problem amongst just black people, as if they exist in a completely, entirely separate culture than the rest of all of America. It's the fact that low income tends to have correlations of higher crime. So not, coming at this with absolutely no data to support any of the claims that you're saying, but simply saying that how can police be racist when black people need them to protect them from other black people? And yet, when we hear from a lot of other either black organizations, leaders, or black communities, they are just as mad at the police killing them as they are as black people killing other black people. It's an attack on multiple fronts, and I don't really see anything solving this issue by making the argument that we should just leave policing the way it is, or leaving the material conditions that leads to these high crime rates the way it is. I don't see anything actually productive coming out of this conversation whatsoever, but I do think that if we taught our kids the actual history of this country a lot more in depth than other than just saying, yes, we had slaves, but we also freed them, so we kind of did right by everybody. If we could get more in depth in that, we might have more critical thinking leaders in the future who can actually address the social conditions that we are currently facing and will continue to face, because right now our leaders are completely neglectful, inept, and dumb. So, cool.
Back to how most black people feel about that. Statistically, right now, not going to be a white person speaking for black people, because then I would be like the former Vice President Joe Biden.
And yet he just did. He's like, I'm not going to speak for black people. And yet he was like, black people really want cops in their neighborhoods because there's other black people killing. Like, he just did that. He just did it. Ugh.
There's another one that people say, okay, well, all right, fine. So maybe it's not based on the slave patrols if you look at, but still, slave patrols were a thing, right? Do any of us deny that those existed? That's the other argument they'll sort of walk you down the trail to. Clip.
But the fourth area, which is for 400 years has been a problem in our country, racial relations and the role of police in that, with the original slave catchers, then during segregation we enforced that. That is still the unresolved issue.
Yeah, well, that walking anti-Semitic cartoon is off base.
He was probably there.
Yeah, he was probably there.
Firsthand now.
So look,
I sent him back.
Slave-catching militias did exist in the South, okay?
Right.
Of course. This is absolutely true.
Policing, that's definition policing. That's it. It has nothing to do with actual police or what it is now. It's just a word that can be attributed to both things. It doesn't mean that the actual force is based on that.
No, exactly. And that's important. Also, when you look at their realms of authority, very different. So slave-catching militias, they had nothing to do with policing systems that both sort of predated them or the official policing system thereafter. Now, there are different people will claim some different dates. The most accurate that I can find is the first slave patrols appeared in the South in 1704. I believe it was one of the Carolinas. I don't know. You have it in the overlay. One of you guys can let me know. This was after the Civil War. This was the Republicans, Reconstruction era, right? The Republican North, who won, forced the Democrat South, who lost, to acknowledge to help pass the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments, which made slavery, therefore slave patrols, illegal. Right?
Just the Carolina colonies back.
Yeah, and after I had given you a little bit of historical context, it was 150 years after that slave patrol was founded. So in 1704, they were, and then 150 years later, about 160, they were found to be illegal because slaves no longer existed within the United States, lest you be charged of a felony.
then.
Carolina colonies back then. I knew it started with a C, though. Just like the White House. By contrast, this is important to note, the police force, they still existed.
Yeah.
Slavery outlawed, the police force existed, and even included black Americans. In 1867, African Americans, they were appointed to the police department in, you may not know this, Selma, Alabama.
Wow.
Kind of iconic there.
Unbelievable.
So this is important for people to understand that the official American police force, now their job was to enforce the laws. Part of that was breaking up slave patrols.
Yeah.
There was an American government waged war against these slave patrol militias, including, by the way, the United States Navy engaged in anti-slave patrol. They fought slave patrols. Yeah, they fought slave patrols. And you can't find this online. You can bring up that overlay.
See, this is exactly the same kind of history lesson I'm telling you, is that, like, yes, we had slave patrols, but then our Navy came through and broke them up. So we're actually the good guys. It's like, we still did a little bit of both, and we had to pass legislation and spill a bunch of blood before we actually got to the point where the things that we thought were wrong were no longer right or in existence. So it's just very fascinating. That's literally like the encompassing of my entire American history lesson into like one example from Steven Crowder.
That's from Thomas Sowell.
Again, just because the U.S. Navy broke apart the organizations that were known as slave patrols does not mean that our police departments did not adopt some of the tactics, or maybe even some of the people who worked for those slave patrols. Did they arrest the people who were slave patrollers? Probably not. Probably not all of them. Maybe some. I doubt. I doubt very much that a lot of them went to jail, but I could see a lot of them just easily moving into a police force since they had the necessary training already. Right? So
I had to go back to a hard copy of Thomas Sowell's book.
And find it?
I could not find it. I had to go into one of those book websites. I think it might have been Goodreads or Audible.
Yeah.
Type in Thomas Sowell, Police, Slave Patrol, U.S. Navy to find it.
Oh my
And Thomas
gosh.
Sowell, that's a white man.
This is also something people need. Slave Patrol is not only.
that's funny. I like how like they're like, oh yeah, and you know, Thomas Sowell would know so much about this because he's black. Yeah. Oh my god. And I've done one video of Thomas Sowell, and he's very much just he's a liar just as much as any of them. It's very fascinating to me about Thomas Sowell too, is that he's an intellectual who like goes off of the image and appearance of being an anti-intellectual. He's a walking doublethink, you know. It's anyways. Let's see here. Without warrant or permission, slave patrols could enter the home of anyone, black or white, suspected of sheltering escaped slaves. All right. The first black codes were passed in 1865, shortly after the ratification of the 13th Amendment outlawing slavery. The codes were laws that specified how, when, and where freed slaves could work and how much they would be paid. Essentially, the black codes maintained the de facto structure of slavery without formally calling it slavery. Other black codes restricted blacks' right to vote, dedicated how and where they could travel and where they could live, because many ex-Confederate soldiers had transitioned to working in policing or elsewhere in the justice system, aka possibly judges. The justice system, including law enforcement, perpetuated the oppression of African Americans. In the 1880s, new forms of black codes known as Jim Crow laws were enacted across southern states, in effect until 1965. These new laws prohibited blacks and whites from sharing public spaces such as schools, libraries, bathrooms, and restaurants. The hardships of life for African Americans in the Jim Crow South, Mississippi specifically, are the focus of a recent book by Jim Sturkey called Hattiesburg, an American City in Black and White. And there's another, good source if you really want it. Perhaps the most infamous image from this era is the separate but equal water fountain for white versus colored individuals taken in 1950 by Elliot Erwitt in North Carolina. Blacks who broke the law or violated norms during the Jim Crow period were often met with brutality at the hands of the police. So there is a much direct since the adoption of slave patrollers into the police departments or the adoption of slave patrol tactics is an invalid argument to Steven Crowder, there is at least 100 years worth of more history where law enforcement were mainly used to police black people after they had been freed from slaves. Or freed from slavery, which I find interesting is because every time we have, like I said, the American history lesson, or at least in the common knowledge is that we were slave owners and then we freed the slaves and then no more racism. And then 100 years later, we gave them voting rights. And guess what? Even less racism than before. And it's never gone away. Do you really think that the Confederates lost the war, the ones who survived, and went about their days completely, like, just absolved of every feeling that they had before they had gone to war fighting to keep slaves in chains? Do you think they just went and erased all of that white supremacy out of them? You think it just magically disappeared out of them? Also, on top of the fact that even Union soldiers were white supremacists, not to the same extent as the Confederates, but even Abraham Lincoln was a white supremacist. And there's a very famous quote that goes around by him that if he were to make the choice, that a white man would always remain president. All right, that was a lot for me. That was a lot, and I'm surprised. This is going to be a long episode, so if you've already had enough, just finish this clip and then bounce. Like, this is going to be a long one.
Not only were they not official police,
Yeah.
The United States police have never been slave patrol. Modern policing departments, like we said, they existed to fight slave patrols. Now, I understand there were some, obviously...
Modern police departments were not brought up to destroy slave patrols. Again, there were already military. It was the military that was used to go through and destroy these. The other police departments were usually brought up to protect property, to keep an eye on the now freed slaves, and also bust unions, which originally started out as, rich people would kind of pay for these private services, but then it became too much of a financial burden on them. So the rich capitalists of the time, the industrialists, they found a way to get the states to adopt these police departments and basically what we consider now deputize them, and now we all pay for them through our taxes. Originally, they were private entities mainly for the capitalists' use of protecting of property. But later, as time evolved, they realized, well, we can actually use this to protect our property and also, let's see, what's the word I'm looking here? Not manipulate, but kind of herd the masses into law and order while they also pay for it. So, again, there's extensive reading in history on this. So, there's no reason that Crowder shouldn't be aware of this, because if he did this much research to prepare himself for his show, then I would think that he would know these things and is just cherry picking the info that fits into a conservative worldview. That would be my assumption here.
Vigilante groups, the KKK, right?
Yeah.
These places exist. They stuck around after the war, but since this was illegal, they Congress passed the KKK Act of 1871, and martial law allowed for the arrest of the KKK in South Carolina. Here's something else that is important. You just talked about the policing definition. Now,
and then when Woodrow Wilson, maybe not at the exact same time, but in the 1920s, the KKK made a resurgence, and Woodrow Wilson didn't do anything about them. Woodrow Wilson being a Civil War lost cause revisionist himself, sympathizing with the Confederates and segregating the federal government, their own employees from each other. The KKK was able to make a successful resurgence in the 1920s. And from what I understand, too, is that it became more of like an MLM, like a, kind of a pyramid scheme. But, that's for later. That's for other stuff. The thing that sucks about America is that we are suffering many crises and many issues, problems. A lot of things are deteriorating and a lot of things are becoming more hazardous, more dangerous. And it's just unfortunate because people should be able to become as familiar with a certain social issue as they possibly can. Like, if we were more familiar with a lot of these issues, we could attack one by one. But since we're so scatterbrained, we constantly just gather as much information as we can to argue our side, and then we go and we do that, never really actually solving anything radically enough, in my own personal opinion. Everything seems to kind of go in increments. But yeah, it's just a bummer. So like, while I can just offer all of this, not all of it, but I can offer some resources into some autonomous research and development for you to become better familiarized with the history of policing in America. It's just one issue that we're facing, and it's not like everybody can spend or dedicate an entire year to becoming familiarized with that subject and let the other crises fall to the wayside if you're constantly engaging in these political debates, whether it be on Twitter or in the streets. So it's just very unfortunate.
I know I'm getting a little nerdy here, but this matters.
Yeah.
Comparing modern police to slave patrols is like comparing the FBI to mall security guards. Slave patrols never had the authority to do what modern police do, right? They didn't give traffic citations. They didn't respond
because that wasn't required of them, and we didn't have cars. What the fuck kind of argument was that? Traffic violations? They were on horses, bitch. Like, what the fuck? Holy shit. Oh my god. They didn't have the same authority. They weren't giving out traffic citations. What the fuck? In 1704, they weren't giving out traffic citations, Crowder? No fucking way.
to domestic disputes from free people. They existed solely to retrieve slaves to their Southern Democrat slave owners.
Yeah.
Which they had the authority to do. Like, there would be nobody before 1865 that would say, hey, you slave patroller, that's illegal for you to do. You know why, Crowder? Because they had the authority to do it. There was no reason for them to have authority for traffic citations. They were slave patrol. Oh, man. I get why this show's funny now, is because you're like, the parts where you're supposed to take him serious is where he like really dumbs it down, and that's very funny to me. That is very funny. Oh shit.
They didn't have authority over non-slaves. It's much more like a private security firm. Their main functions, where I have this here to make sure: chase down, return to the owner's runaway slaves, to provide a form of organized terror to deter slave revolts, and to maintain.
Oh my God! In the like, he pulls up this source, which is the History of Policing in the United States, Part 1. It is a full-on free reading that you can find through Google, and not once does he try to actually pick apart the arguments or even the historical context that is given in this. Not once. Does he try to debunk the myth using the... Wow. Fucking wow. He uses a piece to reinforce his point here, but if you were to read the entire thing, it would debunk his entire segment. My hat's off to you, Crowder, because anybody taking in this shit is... Wow. Ho ho. Ho ho. Oh, man. All right. Wow. Like, he straight up uses a source that would debunk the entire point of the existence of this video segment. And he uses it to reinforce a point that he is making, that Slave Patrol did not have the same authority as today's police departments, which of course they didn't, because again, it was a different time, a different place, and they were operating for different reasons. Holy shit, bro. Ugh. Like, people get these platforms, they get these, like, they get so many eyeballs and so many ears and so many brains to develop and, bring into civil discourse and good faith discussion and maybe even some self-actualization that will lead to better development of the person. But no, they use their platform and they use their power to do the exact opposite, which is convince every single one of us who live on the bottom line of shit to fight against our best interests. It is so weird. Our best interest has nothing to do with the status quo and the way things are. It always has to do with how things could be better. And that's what he's arguing against. Oh. Just imagine if all of these conservatives just chose one day to use their power actually for the best interest of others rather than for themselves and the people they work for. And how quickly shit could change. Oh my God.
Summary justice outside of the law. These were their roles, to act as though that's the same as a cop saying, "Hey, you know what? You were going too fast."
Yeah.
Or, "Hey, you can't beat your wife." They never had that authority.
Weren't they hired by the plantation owners?
Yes.
Yeah, so they were like what are the Dog the Bounty Hunter? They're like kind of bounty hunters.
They were either
mercenaries.
Democrat racist plantation owners themselves,
Right.
who formed these militias,
Yeah.
or they outsourced private sort of militia security.
The political parties in the United States haven't always been Republican Democrats. Just so you know, because I'm sure there were slave owners that weren't Republican. Apparently, from my understanding, is that the Republican Party did separate from the Whigs because of the slavery issue. The Whigs did not want to give up slavery. Republicans did, and that's where the split happened. But yeah, I think Democrats didn't even come into power until about the 1800s. So even before then, there wasn't necessarily the Republican Democrat dichotomy that we're still suffering through today. So yeah, it's just weird because they always focus in like, oh yeah, the KKK was a Democratic party. Oh yeah, the racist Confederates were Democrats, and they use that today as if to pretend that like Republicans in the 50s didn't fight really hard to keep Jim Crow.
Militias, sometimes for profit.
So, I mean, they literally were a private security firm.
Effectively, yeah.
When you really think about it.
Yeah, they were.
This is the laziest argument that I've seen. By the way, when I was doing research,
I know.
Yeah, me too.
On this, the better argument that I saw, and I'm surprised somebody hasn't made against anti-capitalists, is that actually business owners were more in favor of a police force to make sure that you had a really working class and people to buy your products, not to stop crime.
No.
They weren't necessarily even worried about that. I was like, oh, you can say the big corporations did it, and they suck.
And you know what else? This is something I can't say is necessarily... I can't say that this is 100% fact.
See, and that is they are getting in some truth here, is that yes, originally they were paid for by the capitalists, by the corporations, by the big money in this country. But then eventually they realized that they could actually convince American people that they needed police force and that you needed to pay for it. So the state basically adopted it. The state adopted what was once before privatized property protection agencies and turned them into state law enforcement, and we foot the bill for them. That's how things evolved. But they're ignoring that very last piece about how it evolved. They're just saying, see, the slave patrols were only for the plantation owners. See, the Union Busters and all of them were just Pinkertons, when Pinkertons are the only ones who probably stayed private throughout this entire thing, which I found out from last year after a Pinkerton shot a protester in Colorado. The Pinkertons are still a thing, which I'm very, very much surprised about. And I would love to see the Pinkertons make this same kind of argument, how they're not rooted in racism and anti-union busting and all of that shit. But yeah,
that this is the reason why, but you can look at the trends and why did they include black members in their police force early on when there was still racism going on. Big part of that is because, again, think about this in the time historically, freed black people now, a lot of them migrating north, they now have purchasing power.
Yeah.
And so that's important to the economy. And so you want to make sure that they're not the victims of racism in these communities, even though slavery was outlawed. So it was important. That's why they actually wanted to make sure to sort of ingratiate themselves to the black community.
Oh yeah. Yeah, the law enforcement was happy to be the security of the black community that was just freed from slavery, as if like lynchings were not an epidemic between 1865 and the death of Emmett Till. Like what? Oh my God, dude. just like the complete absence of historical context really just reinforces the white supremacy and the idea that the whites, yes, they did enslave black people, but they figured out that it was wrong, and then they figured out that they need police to protect the black people from the racist bad white people. Ugh, terrible arguments. And like I said, this is going to be a longer episode because we're about an hour in and we still have part 2 to get through. So yeah, if you don't want to hear the rest of this, just hop out and go read a book. I highly recommend The End of Policing. But we're going to get into part 2 now.
Let's move on to the next argument. You hear this a lot from Kamal Bell. Modern prisons, this is another claim, are just an extension of slavery, right? You see the slave patrol, police force, and then modern prisons, and that just turned the modern police into effectively slave catchers. It's cute. Here you go.
The 13th Amendment to the Constitution makes it unconstitutional for someone to be held as a slave. In other words, it grants freedom to all Americans. There are exceptions, including criminals.
There's a clause, a loophole.
If you have that embedded in the structure, in this constitutional language, then it's there to be used as a tool for whichever purposes one wants to use it.
That is an official Netflix. That's like Orange is the New Crap over there, I guess. I can't believe that's a Netflix. What did they
Yet again, rather than deconstructing the argument or going through the argument of the clip that they decided to play, let's just make fun of it by doing an Orange is the New Black joke as if that isn't tired and that's the only. Oh my God. It kind of fits because 13th is talking about the evolution of slavery from the streets to the prison halls. But I just want to get some context here since Crowder's just going completely ad hominem cartoonish. Amendment 13 here says, Section 1, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States, or any place subject to their jurisdiction. Section 2 says Congress shall have no power or shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. So Section 2 just reinforces the authority of that. So Amendment 14 also kind of reinforces a lot of rights here, but yeah, except as a punishment for crime. Except for crime. Yep. So, I mean, it was a nice little loophole there for the southern states to say, hey, well, if you can prove that these people that you hate so much have committed a crime, then you can force them into indentured servitude, which, in fact, we still kind of participate in today as the past, 3 years of the wildfires in California. Prison inmates have been used to fight those wildfires and were paid about $1 a day to do so, while also not building not being able to as soon as they get out of jail. I think they get a slightly reduced time, and they get $1 a day. But when they get out of jail, they're not allowed to use that training and that experience to then become a firefighter. That's a bit slavish, isn't it? Like using people, paying them really low, and then not really offering them the economic opportunity once they have their own freedom to chase their happiness, as we put it. So I don't know. I know Crowder thinking like, oh, this is just a ridiculous claim, and that's why I get to make fun of it here on my conservative talk show. It has some validity to it, and you should treat it as such, and you should actually break it apart as if it was an argument and not just some wily statement by a comedian who gets paid too much to misdirect people.
Did they pick someone off the street who looked exclusively bored?
Obama's on the board. I have seen the documentary, yeah.
Yeah.
It's a little. They definitely put it together in a way where it is jarring.
Oh, of course they do. So, of course, look.
I like how his criticism is they give us this information in a way that's jarring, as if like the jarring information, it just isn't that in itself. Like I watched I watched that documentary and fuck, man, it broke my heart. And honestly, if you don't feel any sympathy after watching that documentary, then you just might be a conservative who I don't know, needs more self-reflection. I'm not really sure. Our prison system's a little bit fucked, and it's very weird that he would say it's presented in a jarring way and not necessarily that it actually had an impact on him. Because if he was to say that, then he would feel sympathy for felons, and then if you feel sympathy for a felon or even see the humanity in a felon, you're no longer a conservative.
This is, again, the sniff test. To act as though prisons, and look, there's a disproportionate amount of black people in prisons right now in the United States.
Thanks,
of America.
Kamala.
Right, yeah, Kamala, Maxine Waters.
Yeah, literally just the Democrats. Just the Democrats are the reason why we're seeing the highest incarceration rate in the entire globe, in the so-called freest nation on that same globe.
You look at some of these people and how they actually were fighting against the crack epidemic. They were more aggressive because they saw that it was destroying their communities.
Oh, you mean Ronald Reagan? It's very funny to me because they'll attribute, like, you know, Democrats who did do, you know, historically racist shit of the time. But then when, like, Richard Nixon, Republican, or Ronald Reagan, Republican, come into the conversation, it's just the 60s and the 80s, you know? There's no one to blame. It's just the time.
Serving nonviolent offender.
Yep. This is so insulting to members of the black community that, they're just being rounded up. No, look, you commit crimes, you go to jail, regardless of your race. Now I understand everyone here agrees that nonviolent drug offenders should not be going to jail.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay?
Ever.
Yeah, but then, like, what is the ultimate goal of jail? Like, you commit a crime, you go to jail, and then what, Crowder? Are we expecting recidivism? Is the next goal for recidivism to expect them to be coming back later? Are we keeping them in the prison system to continue to prolong their life in servitude? Are we planning on just doing, you know, capital punishment? Are we going to kill everybody that gets convicted of a crime? What is the end goal of jail? Because then we have to also apply our critical thinking to see if that is actually either increasing the effects of racist policies, decreasing the effects of racist policies, or if they're actually helping the citizenry rehabilitate themselves to further become good Samaritans. What's the actual concern here? Because just saying, like, yeah, no duh, we have, if there's crime, we grab criminals and we throw them in jail. Does that really solve the problem? Does it? If we just take everything that we don't like, throw it in a building without windows, does it solve the problem?
And I think we can then get into the history of the drug war and what happened. Sure, absolutely. But this idea that today police exist simply to be modern slave catchers, like they're the dog.
It's very interesting that he said we could talk about the war on drugs. We could talk about it, but we're not going to. As if that actually has nothing to do with the racist policies that led to the massive incarceration rate of black communities, which it did. Like, that's why I said Nixon. He was very focused on throwing away not only hippies, but he also wanted to throw away black people. It was a very targeted focus, and that's actually, like, people always bring up the argument that it was marijuana was criminalized because of the paper industry, or it was criminalized because of big pharma. While some of that may be true, because there's always special interests from different angles, there's also the idea that mostly the black community was smoking these things, and so if we target marijuana, we target them. Voila, a new legalized slave work labor force that nobody will feel sympathy about because, you guessed it, they're criminals. It's all interconnected. None of this is happening in a vacuum. We can't have a conversation about whether police have racist origins or even adopted racist policies if you can't actually talk about the historical context that led us to the point that we're at today. If you'll say that we'll talk about it at some point, or we could talk about it, then we're not talking about it, and it's not relevant to the discussion that you're having, which seems to be full of fucking holes, and it's pissing me off. All right.
Catcher and all dogs go to heaven, or insert whatever Disney lady in the tramp. It's not true. Again, not to mention that how many cops are just at 15% of them are black themselves right now. Right? This is important to note. Again, they didn't get the memo, but let's look at the crime rates. Why are there more blacks in prisons right now in the United States? In 2018, blacks made up 53% of homicides, 60% of robberies in the United States, despite being 12% of the population. Right? Well, they're still 23% less likely to be shot than whites by police.
But look at the base.
23% less likely. That is one hell of a spin on that on that statistic, because they're 3 times more likely to be shot by police. So that was a very interesting spin on that, because if they're 23% less likely, that still doesn't say who's more likely. Yeah, that was a terrible spin on that. And I guess, like, if you want to get more in-depth data on that, mappingpoliceviolence.com is updating daily. So there's another resource for you rather than just taking a statistic from some dude.
It's that if you're going to send people, you can already, like, it's for cheap labor, right? We can already send that labor overseas to real slaves. So we're not going to do it over here in America.
Right. Yes, exactly.
They're doing it for us overseas.
They are. I mean,
and yet again, it's in our Constitution, so it's an option. It's a viable option, and it is used. So, like, I can understand that, yes, we use, or American corporations use child labor and really low-wage labor across the oceans, but that does not mean that we don't do it in the same way with our local prison population. It would be ignorant to say that it is not happening to our prison population.
It's ridiculous.
Well, and it's kind of like the voter ID thing. You know, it basically, and we've had people on this show that were black make the point that it's that black people are too stupid to get an ID. Really? That's what you're saying by this?
Right.
You're saying that black people commit crimes because there's a police force that exists to get them and put them in prison?
Yeah, you have black people who, right now in this country, right now,
the systemic racism isn't just because there are police there to catch the black people who are breaking the laws. It is much deeper in that, in the way that we have treated black people since they have been freed, mainly in the communities that we have gotten them into. If you want to even talk about the Tulsa Massacre, which is a pretty, it's only one of the massacres that happened, but it was on Black Wall Street, what was known as Black Wall Street in this America. One of the richest black communities in America was destroyed by a white supremacist riot. I can only imagine what the intergenerational wealth would have been contributed to that community had it not been curtailed by a bunch of racist white assholes. So when we're talking about systemic racism in this country, it goes all the way back to where they started, and they started far behind the white man in this race. And so there's just so much historical context that constantly gets pushed out of the way out of this, because it isn't the fact that the police are there and that's why there's higher crime. It's actually the fact that there's just low economic opportunity, and crime does actually pay off when we talk about drug dealing, which is usually the most prominent, and what most people are in drug for is nonviolent drug offending crimes. And that's why the war on drugs is also contributed to racist policy, because it focused on condemning and demonizing black people. There's a lot of historical context being missed here. Like, we're just cherry picking and then saying like, that's weird that this doesn't prove that there's racism going on when I don't look at the full picture. That's weird.
And unfortunately, a big part of it is because they've been lied to. I've talked about this in the past, and I don't ever want to use the word victim, but you have leftist propagandists. You have the George Soros, the James Camerons of the world. You have the CNN, the MSNBCs. And these are people who are dyed-in-the-wool leftists. This is what I've talked about with Change My Mind, where you cannot change their mind at all. And so you have to make an example of them, like we're trying to do right now, to make sure that you understand the truth. And then there are people who buy into it. And those people aren't actively engaged in a lie. Unfortunately, they have been lied to. And that's many black Americans right now who believe that the police force is rooted in the slave patrol, and it's open season to hunt black people. And so what happens? You end up with more violence. You end up with more riots. You end up with more revolts. And who does that hurt most? Again, black people in their communities. Keep in mind, too, they commit crimes at a higher rate. This is a statistical reality. YouTube, Facebook, fact check it all you want. Send them to Snopes for all I care. Just make sure you send them a hard copy of Thomas Sowell's books. How about that for balance? Let's just move on here. Look, this is what happens.
That's amazing. Like, I don't remember how many references and sources that I've given. I think it's somewhere between 4 and 5. Not a lot, it's not a lot, but it's something, right? And each of them are, the podcast itself is probably going to take you somewhere between 6 to 8 hours to get through all of that. The books, depending on how fast you can read, are pretty decent reads. He offers you Thomas Sowell, and he's done it twice now. Thomas Sowell is also a liar. And he also misses context, and he also distorts things. And he's kind of a revisionist in the same way that Crowder is too. So don't just read Thomas Sowell. In fact, if you do read Thomas Sowell, try to think as critically as possible as you can to the words that he says, because I've watched many of his videos and he is just as much Candace Owens as Candace Owens is. In fact, he's probably the prerequisite to Candace Owens. And maybe you don't agree or disagree with Candace Owens, but she definitely says a lot of abhorrent things, in my personal opinion.
So this is what happens as an example. We have a very clear example this week.
Yeah.
Of what happens when you don't have police. This is the end game in black areas. So here's a police call, I think, right? We have a police call of officers trying to help black citizens in the Floyd Autonomous Zone. Instead, the woman, who I believe was of color, we don't have the exact report right now, but that's what it seems to be, was bleeding out and has to be moved blocks away because of the Black Lives Matter activists and their Antifa toadies refusing to allow the police entry. Here's a bone-chilling police call.
321, is it possible to have her move at least a block away, maybe 38 and 10?
She is bleeding and cut everywhere, but we'll call her back and ask.
What's fascinating here is that Crowder gave like a separate headline to the headline of this. This from National File says Minneapolis police refused to enter George Floyd Autonomous Zone, forced bleeding woman to go to them. And yet, like, he framed it as they weren't letting them into the autonomous zone, which I would believe because they don't normally want the police to go into these autonomous zones. But the headline of this article says that the police refused. So let me see here. Got to do some autonomous research and development. Go to enter George Floyd Autonomous Zone. To enter. National Life. I found the same article. This is from 7 days ago. She is bleeding and cut everywhere, but we'll call back and ask her to move a block away. Let's see here. Minneapolis police are refusing to enter the George Floyd Autonomous Zone, with emergency responders instructing a bleeding woman who was pushed out of a window to go to them. Let's see. Known as George Floyd Square or the Free State of George Floyd, the area surrounding the death site of Floyd has been operating as an autonomous zone independent from... this website is terrible. Oh my god. It just keeps scrolling and scrolling. Independent from control of the police or emergency services since September last year, encompassing 7 to 8 blocks in total, with police refusing to enter lest they face violent reprisals from radical Antifa. So, I mean, yeah, they're refusing because they usually don't let them in. Yeah, that's true. One particularly disturbing incident took place at the end of last month, where a female victim was pushed out of a window in a domestic dispute on the corner of 38th and Elliott. Police dispatch audio revealed the attitude taken by police regarding breaching the George Floyd Autonomous Zone. Quote, "Is it possible to have her move at least a block away, maybe to 38th and 10th?" asked the police officer responding to her 911 call. Quote, "She is bleeding and cut everywhere, but we'll call her back and ask her to move a block away," unquote. The dispatcher responded with the woman ordered to move despite her severe injuries. Multiple people have died within the George Floyd Autonomous Zone, with the police unable to respond to their calls. Lanisha Columbus, a pregnant black woman who was shot in the zone, and police officers set up their staging area half a mile away from the incident. We'll meet at 34th and Elliott soon. No lights or sirens, please. An officer told dispatch Columbus died. More recently, Emaz Wright was shot during a gang-related shooting on March 6th. Police were informed that her and another victim would be carried to the edge of the zone. Wright died. It was unfortunate. It's truly unfortunate. Even before the autonomous zone had been properly created, one man died due to caretakers of what was then just a memorial for George Floyd, blocking access to emergency services. And that's kind of I have a bit of a criticism is that if we're going to have autonomous zones, I know that a lot of these protesters and organizations are working with little to no resources, but the unfortunate thing is if we're going to claim autonomy, you have to have alternatives. So I'm not too familiar with the situation going on specifically at the Free State of George Floyd, but I would have to say that if they are not going to let police into the area, then it is kind of the community's duty to figure out how they are going to protect people at this point, because if you're not going to allow law enforcement to come in, you do need peacekeeping, because it seems that there have been multiple people killed already. There still is violence and humanity, so I would assume that you have to create a good alternative to the police force that you were supposedly keeping out. And I would actually love to see success on that side so that we can see the suffrage within that zone go down. But yeah, that's really unfortunate. But this is a great opportunity. If you were going to have George Floyd Square, this is a great opportunity to create an alternative to the police, law enforcement, and do something about it. So, that's unfortunate. I wanted to get the whole article in context because the headline and Crowder's reading were a little bit misleading. So, yeah.
After a move block away.
Oh, well, I'm so glad that white people are able to speak for the black community.
Unbelievable. I almost would say get the SWAT truck out and literally say, guys, in 3 seconds, we're coming through this area. If your body has not left the space, it will be ejected.
We're talking about a riot and insurrection on January 6th. You have had for months people being shot, bleeding out in autonomous zones, which, by the way, is treason. Okay? Is treason. It's anarchy. Autonomous zones have been shot. Multiple people. That woman's bleeding out. The police are too afraid to enter, and not a peep because someone.
Very fascinating to me because it's just like, it seems contradictory to the position of a conservative that individual freedom is the highest of priority, but a collective of individuals aren't allowed to have an autonomous zone that says, hey, we don't want law enforcement, or at least the state's law enforcement in there, which I find very fascinating as well, because, you know, with the Second Amendment sanctuary cities, that's exactly what that is saying, is like saying, hey, we don't want federalized police. We don't want our local police, the ones who live within our community, to coordinate with federalized police to take away guns or the like. But yet when a community of people, the actual citizens of America, the true constituents of democracy, when they choose to be autonomous in their own law enforcement, that's treason. And anarchy is treason. Going through mutual aid and not necessarily, like, they're ripping apart their dependency from the government, which is another conservative talking point, mainly in the realm of talking about why people shouldn't be on welfare. They shouldn't be dependent on the government. And when then they are not dependent on the government by saying, hey, we're going into our own autonomous zone and we're going to start our own community watch, neighborhood watch, what have you, that's treason. It's not open war announced against the country. It's just saying, hey, we don't want a bunch of y'all's nonsense coming in here. They still have to pay taxes. Everything operates. It's just basically the request of the community to not have to interact with the law enforcement, which kind of depends with the government that you're dealing with, because a more tyrannical government would say, fuck you, we're bringing our police in, and they would smash it and not allow your neighborhood watch or a community peacekeeping force to operate. A democratic force may just recognize, hey, they don't want our help from our police departments, and so they will create their own apparatus, and we will work with them to cooperate properly so that we can have a civil discourse between communities. But we do not live in that world. We live in a world where automatically treason. That's treason. Traitors. Guillotine. End it.
Someone wore a Viking hat?
Yeah.
Into the halls of Congress?
Exactly, because 800 people decided to get crazy out of 200,000.
Where somebody did get killed.
Yeah.
But just,
and it was
through a window that was
protester.
painted.
Yeah.
Right, one of the people who was protesting.
Yeah.
Exactly. But
I think we'll have a march about that at some point, right?
Yeah, we will have a march.
probably.
It's coming. And here's something else. So we have the sniff test in the beginning.
Scooter march.
It's pretty great. It's the conservative argument is like, if you're dating someone and then they beat you and you're like, okay, I'm leaving you, and then you go and you date someone else and then they beat you, and then your ex calls you up and is like, I heard you got beat, you miss me yet? And it's like, I don't like either of this. I don't like any of this. So again, I'm gonna do something about it. Like, it's weird. Like, yeah, like as soon as the police fuck up, we disrespect the police because they fuck up, and it's their fuck up is a sign of disrespect towards us. And then we go to do our own thing, and because our own thing is experimental and accidents happen, mistakes, the chaos is opened up so that we can create a new order out of it, right? Because those things happen, people get hurt or people die, that we're just supposed to run back to the arms of our former abuser. Like, don't you miss the police now? It's a horrible argument. Mainly because, like I said, if we're going to build these autonomous zones, or if we're going to try something new, especially with socialists and people who are the farther left of the spectrum in politics, that you really, like, you can't convince people to take a position that is radical if you do not offer better alternatives. And most of these better alternatives are going to have to come through experimentation, but better alternatives nonetheless. At least trying something is the key here.
Does it make sense that police, wait, are we the only country with police? Are we the only country with slaves? No. So, okay, the beginning, right, let's go from A to Z. Okay, A doesn't pass the sniff test. But now, let's use another, again, rationalizing technique here, okay, the Socratic method. So let's say that today, let's go with their premise, right, and that's their endgame, no police.
Yeah, Socratic method, like really going about, really always begins with let's say, where, you know, you start with a hypothetical, and then you can actually do oh god, I hate that phrase, because that means he's shifting the goalposts. So here we go.
You see what happens. Okay, if the government were to be outright racist and hell-bent on subjugating disenfranchised citizens,
like it was before 1865,
let's say specifically of an individual race, let's say black people, what would be an important safeguard against it? The government wants to use the cops as a roundup force for a specific group of people. What would be something important to prevent that from happening?
The police?
Close. Second Amendment. Yeah. Second Amendment. There you go. Well, good.
Except the thing is, though, is that and then for some reason, on top of their bulletproof vests, now they're all holding revolvers. God damn it. This is cringe. The thing is, though, is when black people were slaves and they created the private entities, or the slave owners created a force to round up the slaves were not legally allowed to own guns either. They didn't have any of the rights that were within our Constitution. So using that as an argument doesn't fit in that context. So let's try again in the early 1900s. I'm not actually 100% sure in the context of whether or not a lot of black families or individuals actually owned guns before then, before Jim Crow separated, or before the end of Jim Crow. I do know that a lot of legislation come the Black Panther movement removed a lot of guns from black people at that time. Which, you know, again, the police were used to round up those guns. So he's making the argument that the Second Amendment is what's going to protect you from police. But then Adam Toledo, who dropped his gun before the cops shot him, also deserved to die. The 13-year-old who dropped a gun. Yeah, and you remember what happened to Philando Castile? He also had a gun, and he informed the officer who was waiting for his registration and insurance that there was a gun in his glove compartment. And as he was going to get his registration and his insurance for the police officer, after informing him that there was a gun in his glove compartment, the police officer proceeded to draw his gun, scream, and then shoot him. So saying, hey, if you want to be protected from the police, the Second Amendment is your thing, as if like Crowder, the propagandist, wouldn't argue for your justified death for shooting back at the police. Because they did that with Breonna Taylor's boyfriend. They did a no-knock warrant raid on Breonna Taylor's house. They did knock. They announced once that they were police, scared the Breonna Taylor's boyfriend to death after breaking down the door. He proceeded to fire back at them, and then they fired more shots towards him and Breonna, killing Breonna. And yet it was mostly the boyfriend's fault since he shot at police. But the state found him not guilty because he did not know they were police. So we're making the conservative argument that the Second Amendment is necessary to defeat tyranny. But then when it comes into actual anecdotal evidence or a event that happens in reality, it is eventually used, the argument is then used against the perpetrator as, well, they shouldn't have been resisting police, they shouldn't have been shooting at police, and they shouldn't have been doing what they were doing. But of course, since we're talking about white people here, they know that the Second Amendment is much closer and protected for them.
Good trigger control. Dave can take some notes. Now, the second... This is
in hell, boy.
And this is something that's interesting because we've heard people make this argument. The Second Amendment was used to keep slaves, right? Because I'm saying the Second Amendment would be important today if you don't. Even Raz, the war leader, the Coney of Chaz in Seattle,
The
was
man with a $40,000 music grant.
Yes, exactly. And AR-15.
I like how they point Raz as like the Coney leader or a leader of like the Seattle autonomous zone, Chaz. I like how they anointed him to that position when like nobody else at the autonomous zone did that. Like he was just a very loud activist, and the right-wing media cling to him because he said a lot of controversial things, and so they used him to represent the movement as in its entirety, when that's just, again, not grounded in reality. There's a nugget of truth in there, but it popcorned into a bunch of bullshit.
That he handed out to minors.
Right.
They even understand how important that Killer Mike, and he's a moron. They understand the importance of the Second Amendment.
I like it.
But the left one.
Like, why would you even use him to prove your point? He's like, even Killer Mike understands the need of the Second Amendment, and he's an idiot. Like, that proves your point. Yeah, no, leftists, there's leftists that own guns and that see it fit that the proletariat be armed. I think it even says in the Communist Manifesto that by no means should the proletariat be disarmed or something like that the working class should never give up their guns. I think Karl Marx had said something like that. So they're like the John Brown Club is a left-wing militia group. I never see them being watched on Militia Watch, but I'm very, very aware of them. The John Brown Club was some of the people who were up at the Chaz area when that was going on. I'm not sure if any of them are in Minneapolis. To be perfectly honest with you, the John Brown Club is actually pretty under the radar as far as the media goes in a lot of cases, but they're named after John Brown, who was the abolitionist. His birthday was or I guess the anniversary of his birthday was May 9th, and he attempted to actually start a slave revolt. It did end badly, but, he's a fucking legend for trying.
Wants you to believe that Second Amendment was used to keep slaves. This is something you'll see again. If you type in Second Amendment slaves in Google, if you type in Second Amendment in YouTube, you will find nothing but Second Amendment used to keep slaves. Here's what's interesting about that. Not only is that not accurate, it's the exact opposite of the truth. So I found this interesting in colonial America, basically the late antebellum South, right, where slave patrols would have existed.
Yeah.
They were the first places to implement modern gun laws. And I knew this before I started doing research on this yesterday. I knew they were the first place to implement modern gun laws. So I was writing this segment out. I didn't know that there were the Virginia Slave Code made disarmament of blacks mandatory to prevent insurrections. So I knew that it was a roundabout way. So this is one thing we talk about quite a bit, right?
That's very weird. He used the Second Amendment. He's like, if you want to protect yourself from slave patrol, Second Amendment, and as we all know, slaves didn't have any amendments on their side. But also then, too, he brings up the fact that, like, Virginia, right? Virginia, or was it? Let me see here. For prevention whereof future be it enacted, the king's most excellent majesty. I think it was Virginia. Let's see.
And insurrections. So I knew that of blacks. I didn't know that there were specific. The Virginia Slave Code made.
Yeah, Virginia Slave Code. So, like, yeah, they disarmed black people. Yeah. Yeah. And how does this prove your point? That, like, because, like, there was at no point were they really allowed to defend themselves.
Disarmament of blacks mandatory to prevent insurrections. So I knew that it was a roundabout way. So this is one thing we talk about quite a bit, right? We talk about Jim Crow, Democrat laws, Jim Crow in the South, right? We talk about them trying to infringe on the Democrats' civil rights. We talk about them sort of disenfranchised, literacy tests. Okay, all from Democrats, by the way. Why don't we talk about the specific...
See, and Crowder's not wrong, is that, like, Democrats did start a lot of those racist policies, but Republicans were the ones who clinged on it in the late, in the second half of the 20th century. So you can blame Democrats for starting the racist policies, but you can then blame Republicans for clinging on to them and refusing to let go of them for the past, like almost 100 years.
Targeting in this country by removing firearms exclusively from people of color. And by the way, today let's just change that to extremist. Today let's just change that to mental health issues. You took a Xanax, you can't have a gun.
Republicans.
Let's just change it to Republicans.
Yeah, because that's really
How is this a problem?
I like how he was able to conflate all of that. They had the pretext to take the guns away from the black people, and then they came for the mental health, and then they came for the Republicans. Like, what a conflation, honestly. But the thing is, too, is that back then, when that slave code was written, saying the disarmament of black people was enacted into law, it was mostly muskets and swords. We didn't have guns that would have a semi-auto and full auto switch. So, while I do support the Second Amendment to an extent, our guns have increased in kill capacity. And so with our Second Amendment absolutism, I mostly worry about the mental health of America. And I feel like there's not enough discussion going into the mental health crises that we face in America that would lead to us having 26 mass shootings in a month. And I'm talking about this month. So...
Though once Lady Antebellum, the band changed their name to Lady A.
Well, they stole it from a black lady
and
who
then
got
sued
pissed.
a black lady.
Well, it was all.
I thought that fixed everything.
It did, yeah. So did.
There's actually Chief
No
Justice
one cared.
Justice Taney ruled in Dredd versus Scott. I am the law. 1D Dredds that blacks could not be considered citizens because it would give them the right to keep and bear arms.
Unbelievable.
So again, it was often used as the final remaining measure of targeting and subjugating Southern blacks.
I feel stupid about my answer because I had a gun in my hand.
Right. You know who else
You
was
feel
really,
powerful with your answer.
really
I
fond
do.
of disarming populations that they wanted to oppress?
I think you're going to Hitler?
Oh, yeah. Well, Pol Pot too. So,
Pol Pot,
yeah,
that one.
cut from the same
There's
cloth.
probably more.
Stalin.
There's probably
Yeah,
quite a few.
Lenin.
I mean, Mussolini.
There's another one.
There's
Yeah.
like all these guys. They're
I
all
don't
like
give
really
none
bad,
of my prisoners
really bad
weapons.
people.
This is an example.
Yeah, the UK. You want to talk about the UK, who also has like their citizens don't even have handguns? Like, honestly, god damn, dude, just the disingenuous like framing that constantly goes into these shows. Like, the UK doesn't really allow guns. A lot of Europe, the European Union doesn't really have absolutism in guns as we do. I think like the most of like the gun freedoms that we see in this country are usually like similar to those of third world countries. Yeah, no, it's just so fascinating that would be the argument there, is that like since Democrats took the weapons away from blacks in the early 1800s and 1900s, that makes them closer to Hitler and Mussolini, when that's just kind of been the norm throughout the rest of the world. Yeah, Yeah, and still just ignoring how Republicans have contributed since 1865 to the further disenfranchisement of Black American citizens, regardless of their freed abolition status. So,
example of white people speaking for black people, saying the police force is racist, the police force was rooted in slavery.
But it's also fascinating, too, because he really just broke down in one segment, specifically talking about their right to bear arms, how the system was racist towards black people. And yet conservatives constantly argue that there has never been and never will be and never has been. All of that, just there's no systemic racism and there's no proof of evidence. And then when they're making this argument that Democrats are racist, it's a systemic problem. So it's just so disingenuous, and it really hurts me because it's just partisan hackery. Really, who's out here to represent the American people? Not CNN, not Fox News, but the American people. Just the people who live and feed their families and go to work and, get dogs, buy products, and try to YOLO all the way to the grave. Who represents them? Honestly, it's crazy.
Because black people don't agree with them. Now, I don't believe that polls should be the basis of laws. I do believe, however, that when you are specifically addressing one community, saying this is what we need to do to help this community, I do think in that scenario, it is relevant what that community thinks. That's where a poll is relevant. You don't say most Americans like theft, therefore socialism. It doesn't matter, we have a constitution. But if you say, and you want to go against the Constitution, you say we don't need a police force because it hurts black people, then it's important to say, hold on a second, black people. Does that 95-year-old .com.gov white hair, blue eye guy, does he speak for you? I thought the number was 68%.
Yeah.
81% of blacks right now in this country support at least as much police presence in their neighborhoods that exist, if not more. That comes from Newsweek. You can go to louderwithcrowder.com with a link in the description for all the details.
I do want to see that link. I actually do want to see that link. Let's see here. Wow. It's not in the description. What the fuck? It's not in the description. There's part 1, then there's like 3 hashtags so that it'll get in the algorithm. Then there's shop the official Louder with Crowder store. Then there's the want to watch the full show every day, join Mug Club. There's the link for that. There's a promo code for $69 a year. If you're a veteran or if you're a student or military, wait, use promo code student veteran military to get daily access for 60. Bruh, like, do you actually have to prove you're a student or a veteran or in the military? Because if not, then like, why are you letting your fans LARP like that? That's fucked up. Why are you letting your people LARP as if they're going to school or have fought in the military? Oh God. Anyways, follow me on Twitter. There's his Facebook. There's behind the scenes footage on Instagram. Where's that link, Crowder? You said it's in the description, Crowder. Where it be? Where it at, though? I don't see it. So I guess I gotta look it up myself because that's what I get the news reported to me for, is to fucking verify it on my own. Newsweek. Police support black communities poll. Ugh. He said the link was in the description. I'm fucking pissed now. I found it. All right. 81% of Americans don't want less police presence despite protests. Some want more cops. This is the poll. A majority of black Americans have said they want police presence in their area to either remain the same or increase despite recent protests over police brutality, according to new polls. I did see that last year, yeah. A Gallup poll conducted from June 23rd to July 6th, surveying more than 36,000 U.S. adults, found that 61% of black Americans said they'd would like police to spend the same amount of time in their community. A Gallup poll conducted of 36,000 U.S. adults. Now, my curiosity, that is a good, pool of people for a poll. I'm just curious as to what community. did they ask? You know? Like, who? Who did they ask? Was it in Washington, D.C.? Because the article here comes from Washington, D.C. So Washington, D.C., when asked whether they want the police to spend more time, the same amount of time or less time than they currently do in their area, most Black Americans, which, again, I feel like my hard thing about studies is that they'll say most Black Americans or they'll say most Americans, but it's like always a small pool of Americans that are doing the poll to represent most Americans. So it's very strange to me. You okay, Rosie? Rosebud? You okay? Okay, I'm just checking. You okay? Yeah, my dog was dreaming pretty hard. So 61%. This is similar to the 67% of all U.S. adults preferring the status quo, including 71% of white Americans. Meanwhile, nearly equal proportions of Black Americans say they would like the police to spend more time in their area, 20%, as they would. So it says Black Americans, 20% want more time spent in their neighborhoods. 61% want same amount of time, and less percent, 19. It seems like pretty much across the board is that everybody wants about the same amount of time that police spend in their neighborhoods. But again, I always just kind of question because each neighborhood is going to be different. So when they say most, I don't know, man. I don't mean to be that kind of skeptic right now, but it's just strange. Frequency with Black Americans, 32% said they see police very often, 41% said sometimes, and 27% said rarely, and it's pretty much consistent across the board. But I guess seeing police and spending amount of time in your neighborhoods isn't necessarily have anything to do with the actual encounters that people have with police. But I guess if they had more negative encounters, they would like to see the police in their communities a lot less, to say that if police were actually contributing to worsening conditions. But yeah. Black Americans' preference for the amount of time police spend in their area is modestly related to their expectation about receiving fair treatment. However, 59% of the relatively small group of Black Americans who are not at all confident that the police would treat them with courtesy and respect want the police to spend less time in their neighborhood. Interesting. Majority of all other Black Americans, including those who are not too confident about receiving considerate police treatment, want the police to spend the same amount of time, with additional percentages favoring more time. Notably, simply having an interaction with the police in the past year has no bearing on Americans' preference for local police presence in the area. 79% of those who have had interaction with the police in the past 12 months say they want the police to spend more or the same amount of time. The bottom line is, it's not so much the volume of interactions Black Americans have with the police that troubles them or differentiates them from other racial groups, but rather the quality of those interactions. That's what I was saying, all right? Most of Black Americans want the police to spend at least as much time in their area as they currently do, indicating that they value the need for this. They value the need for the service that police provide. However, that exposure comes with more trepidation for Black than white or Hispanic Americans about what they might experience in a police encounter. And those harboring the least confidence that they will be treated well, or who have had negative encounters in the past, are much more likely to want police presence curtailed. Thought so. So, yeah, there's data from 36,000 Americans to represent all of America, but all right.
That comes from Newsweek. You can go to louderwithcrowder.com with a link in the description for all the details, all the sources. Let's go to, when people say Republicans are
so I have to go to his website to get sources on the specific episode rather than them just putting it into the description box of the episode. That's fucking cool.
The racist flip.
Gotta get that traffic.
So let's go back in history. All right, so what do we have as far as Democrat racist policies back then? And I don't just want to say, you're racist. No, you're racist. No, let's look at A to Z.
Yeah.
Let's look at the past. Let's look at today. Confederacy. Southern Democrats. Jim Crow, looking at Democrats. Opposition to civil rights, largely Democrats. Robert Byrd, fourth in line.
Largely Democrats. Again, like he's ignoring I'm going in a loop. I don't need to say it. The Republicans were the ones who like really clinged on to Jim Crow during the civil rights fight back in the 1950s and 60s. I'm not gonna rehash all of that. And even now to this day, the last Duke, whatever the fuck his name was, the wizard of the KKK, he ran for office as a Republican. If that doesn't tell you where racism is going in America, then I don't know what will.
For the presidency, if a few planes went down under Barack Obama, who used the N-word repeatedly on air, was the one who stood up and filibustered the Civil Rights Act. Democrats. Gun control laws, exclusively Democrats. Now, let's look at Democrats today. Well, here's the thing. People will say, no, now they're trying to correct it. It's still racism because it is seeing everything through the prism of race. You created gun control laws because you didn't want black people to have guns. You created literacy tests because you didn't...
Hold on. Let's see who was president. Hold on. The president doesn't have all the power. They're just a representation of really what the direction the government's taking. So hold on. Let's see here. I'd type that in fucking terrible. Let's see here. The Mulford Act was a 1967 California bill that repealed a law allowing public carrying of loaded firearms, named after Republican Assemblyman Don Mulford and signed into law by Governor of California Ronald Reagan. The bill was crafted with the goal of disarming members of the Black Panther Party who were lawfully conducting and armed patrols of Oakland neighborhoods in what would later be termed cop watching. Do you see that? How much like research can do for you? Like that's awesome. He's like, that's a Democrat policy. That's a Democrat policy. And that's a Democrat policy. And then when he got to the guns, I was like, no. There's a very specific Republican here I'm thinking of that targeted the black community for their guns. And you guessed it. It was governor at the time, Ronald Republican Messiah Reagan. Awesome, Crowder. Awesome.
Didn't want black people to vote. You guys opposed the Civil Rights Act because Democrats didn't want black people, again, to vote. So even if you look today and you say, well, today, though, they
Lyndon B. Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act into law. Lyndon B. Johnson was, oh shit, you guessed it, a Democrat. I'm not going to give Democrats really that much credit because they still suck in my book, but for the most part they have turned their race relation history in a slightly better degree. Again, they fucked up all over again in the 1990s with the criminal bill just making harsher punishments for drug possessions. That was Bill Clinton and Joe Biden really focusing in on that together as two supreme white men, but they're not a perfect party, but they have been better than the Republicans in the past 70 years. So not much better, but they're like Obama said, Republicans and Democrats are fighting in between the 40-yard lines.
They support affirmative action. You support affirmative action because you exclusively believe that black people cannot make it into universities if not for your help. Just like black people couldn't possibly want the police force.
Yeah, imagine that. Like, imagine if when Abraham Lincoln, I think the legend or the myth goes that allegedly after Abraham Lincoln was to had finally won the Civil War and freed the slaves, that there was a promisement of 40 acres and a mule. That in a way would have been the first affirmative action that actually would have increased the material conditions for black people at the moment, that would have given them a bit of a leg ahead than they did actually receive after Lincoln was assassinated, which was, you guessed it, nothing. So, yeah, you can get mad at affirmative action giving people a leg up these days because of their color of skin. But I'm more mad at it that it's fucking 200 years too late.
even though they, when polled, every single time say, you're wrong and you don't speak for them. Not to mention, of course, they look through the lens of race and they say, oh, an Asian, we have to get them out of Stanford.
Yeah.
Everything back then was seen through the prism of race, and that was seen as, of course, let's oppress these people. And
how can you not actually fix all of the racist policies in the past, which were seen through race, which were enacted through the eyeballs of racists? How can you not alleviate or fix those problems by then observing through race and enacting laws in that? In the same way that the Chinese Exclusion Act banned Chinese immigrants from moving either into the country or even out of the country, you would then have to look at how can we alleviate that, and you would call that a racist policy just because it's trying to help people based on the color of their skin or ethnic origin. There's no way of escaping racist policy if we have to or fix our past discriminatory legislation with now new equitable. It's equitable at this point because we've handicapped everyone who wasn't a Christian white male. So we've had to move forward with equitable policies and legislation to try and fix all of that bullshit that we forced all of our ancestors through. So you can get mad at the fact that we have to do racist shit now to fix the racist shit then, but it's not going to be fixed so long as you have a reactionary position against it just because it isn't white people being helped this time.
now today, every policy that you look at from the Democrats that is designed to come and help you in the name of anti-racism is predicated on the idea that you were oppressed, and even though we're talking about hundreds of years ago, you're so incapable now that let us step in and help. Let us step in and make sure you can get a several hundred-point score, lower score in the SATs. Let us step in.
But that's the thing, though, is that, like, the probability of someone moving from the economic ladder from like working class, low income, poor all the way up to like the top 1% is really lower than 1%. The probability of someone doing that is really low. So the opportunity only to move into the middle class is a higher percentile, and you still have to afford them the opportunities to do so, because with the lack of intergenerational wealth means that they might not have the likelihood to go to a college that is incredibly expensive without a scholarship. So like, yes, there's a level of work that they can do to achieve this, but then there also has to be other variables that go into it, like a house, like a healthy household, a good school that puts them on the right track to going to a college. There's so many variables. So it's not that they're incapable, it's just that it's extremely difficult, and if we could honestly give people support into moving upwards on the economic ladder as being their one stepping stone to at least get them started on that economic ladder, I see no problem with it. I don't. I really don't, but Crowder does, because he thinks people should be able to pull themselves up by their bootstrap, which is actually like an impossible thing to do, and move on from there. So it's very unfortunate, unempathetic, and just not compassionate way of viewing the world.
And make sure that you don't have any police, because that's what you want. They were racist yesterday, they were racist today, and they will be racist tomorrow. The closest.
Remember when Crowder made fun of that guy at the beginning of his hair, like at the beginning, because he said that he like electrocuted himself before his interview and that's why he had that hair? That's that subtle racism that he seems to have completely forgotten about, and is blaming Democrats of the 1850s through the 1920s and the 1960s. He's blaming those Democrats as more racist than his even dog whistly racism that he's been doing throughout this entire segment. Cool.
Thing you have with Republicans is voter ID, and that knows no racial boundaries. I think that Gerald, who's really white, needs an ID just as much as
get a white vest.
Uncle Tim Scott, as Democrats lovingly refer to him. So again, the sniff test. If you go, okay, look, let's say that Donald Trump is a horrible racist who didn't have Arsenio Hall clearly act as a diversity win on Celebrity Apprentice. Let's assume that everything you say is correct. Yeah. But these policies have led to record low black unemployment. They've actually consistently decreased crime until we had the modern pandemic, an excuse to riot. So would you, again, the sniff test, say, let's go the complete opposite direction to help blacks? You had 8 years.
Yeah.
Blacks weren't doing better. 3 years, exponentially better. If you're in this to help black Americans, why would you go the opposite direction?
Yeah.
It doesn't pass the sniff test. And you guys, again, you can comment. You can just comment below. You can't comment right now when it's live, but afterwards, which one do you think is the most egregious? I think the closest thing that people might say for Republicans is, Nixon and the war on drugs, and I think that there's some legitimacy to that claim.
Yeah,
and we'll go into that.
Yeah.
Wow, just wow that he's like, there's legitimacy to Nixon and the war on drugs, but we'll get into that some other time. Even though, like, throughout this whole thing, kind of going through and refuting a bunch of shit that he said, even the article that he posed in the first segment was like a complete opposition of his entire argument. There's plenty of evidence of systemic racism, and I even brought up the fact that, Ronald Reagan and Don Mulford focused on taking guns away from the Black Party or the Black Panther Party. So it's just, yeah, of course, he's just like, I've done my job.
War on drugs, I agree fully.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, and you finally had a president stand up and say, you can do it. If you go out and take full advantage of the system that everybody has access to, you can be a success in life. You don't have to depend on us. Go do it. And they did.
What the actual fuck is he talking about? That they finally had a president who said you could do that. That's literally been every president since, what's his name? Hoover. Like, yeah, FDR did like come through and do a bunch of that like New Deal shit, but like every president runs on the idea that every American can achieve the American dream, which is basically what he just said. So like that is weird to say like, oh, finally we had a president that said you can do anything, when like literally that's what every president runs on, is that like, I will help you achieve the American dream.
Black people said, I'm empowered to go do this. I'm going to go do this. I can do it.
Right.
That's exactly what happened under Donald Trump, and yet he was called a racist.
Yeah.
Well,
because they didn't like it. They were taking black people out of being dependent on the government.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, no, there was no. I'm not gonna get into why Donald Trump was racist. That's a tired, dead horse at this point. But like, good God, guys, come on.
I mean, you would think that, hey, you know what, having safer neighborhoods and having record low unemployment would be important.
Yeah. Because I thought all we had to do for Mexico is make sure that they had jobs so that they wouldn't be coming over the border. I thought that was a good thing for people to have.
Well,
jobs.
there are a lot of Mexican Americans who do have jobs. It's MS-13 crowding our prisons, who for some reason we're not allowed to send back.
And having intercourse at bus stops.
There you go, right there. That's it right there. Why do people call Donald Trump racist? Is because he was the prerequisite to that racist ass shit that you just said right now about Mexicans. And because it's about Mexicans during a segment about black people, it's less racist. Okay. Sure.
Well, you know what? Canadians have been known to do that too. It's the only place to keep warm.
All right. Yeah, cool. Well, I don't think I have time for Ben Chaperone's video now. I'll have to do a two-parter on Ben tomorrow. Probably this video that he did here that I was going to cover, and then his Israel coverage. I'll do that all tomorrow. That's been today's talks. The talk zone is now detoxed, and I'm feeling exhausted as fuck because I haven't done a 2-hour episode in a minute. But goddamn, Crowder. God damn, are you and your crew very dumb, are just like willfully ignorant because it makes you money. It's either you're really stupid and you don't know the historical context and just don't have the time to actually do the full research, or don't have the money to pay someone to do the full research and then tell you about it, or you're being willfully ignorant in the pursuit of a political agenda. I'm kind of on the fence of either really dumb or really political. I can't figure it out. Maybe it's a mix of both. Who really knows? But thank you for joining me on Talks News. This has been an episode for sure. Follow me on Twitter at ToxinPod2XNPOD. The YouTube channel is linked in the description below. If you're listening to this on the YouTube, hopefully someday I get my video back up, but you can also listen to this on any podcast platform that you prefer. Shouts out to Anchor, which allows me to do this for free and distribute it to all of those platforms. And other than that, live free or die hard the Bruce Willis way. That's how I'm ending the episode. Okay, well, peace out.